to talk a little bit about Lynne Pearce, and thank you for putting on this fantastic session today. So Lynne Pearce, who is she? Well, she is a professor of literary and cultural theory in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University, and of course CeMoRe's acting director. Like Colin, she has participated in CeMoRe events since 2003 and became an associate director in 2015 after her own research underwent its own mobilities turn. I love the way you phrase that. This included her hosting with Peter Merriman of CeMoRe Colloquium on Mobility and the Humanities in 2014, and her research on automobilities culminating in the book Drive Time, which I was reading actually on the train here. So excellent. That was done in 2016. She has a nice, since written another book, Mobility, Memory and Life Course, 2019, using mobilities as a lens through which to explore interpersonal relationships, and is now working on a book on Britain's changing roadscapes. Without further ado, would you please welcome Lynne to the stage.
I'm now thinking about poor Jen, who's been there for a long time, since 5 o'clock in the morning. But soon, Jen, you'll be on. Oh, do I need to get out of David? Is it a stick, David?
No.
No.
Just press escape. Yeah,
just escape.
Yeah. Where is escape?
There.
Maybe click the screen first. Yeah, there you go.
So I'm going to, sorry, I just need to go back into my documents again. There we go. Okay, so of course, as a literary person, after all these wonderful spontaneous talks, mine's going to be a red paper. You know, talking about being a researcher for 30 years, I've always done this and I'm still doing it. So, you know, that's just the way it is for us in literary subjects. So, yeah, well, the first thing to say is that obviously, as CeMoRe's Director for the Humanities, I naturally feel that it falls upon me to say a few words about how the mobility humanities subfield has taken root in the past decade. And I think it is fair to say, no exaggeration, that there's been an exponential growth in research and publications produced under this banner, not least because of the emergence of two really large government-funded centres in the world. First of all, Konkuk's Academy for Mobility Humanities in South Korea. And secondly, the Institute of Advanced Studies in Mobility Humanities at the University of Padua in Italy. Both of these centres CeMoRe's worked closely with since their inception, and with whom Lancaster University now has long-standing partnerships relating to both research and teaching. So this is a really interesting context for people like me and many of my colleagues in the UK to be doing our research. And it's a little bit weird. I mean, Mimi's part of this as well. So myself, my colleague Pete Merriman in Aberystwyth, Pete Adey, all the colleagues at Royal Holloway in London, we spent all our time moving between Konkuk in Seoul and Italy and here. So we're actually talking about mobility systems. We're actually caught up in a new system of, I guess, knowledge and knowledge exchange, which is dependent upon the fact that these centres have really quite large amounts of money put into them, whereas of course CeMoRe now is a non-funded centre. So, you know, that in itself tells a very interesting story, I think. However, on the occasion of CeMoRe's 20th anniversary, it's my good fortune to be able to report that this humanities turn, or as I shall go on to explain, return to humanities content and methods within mobilities related scholarship, does owe its origin in part to the CeMoRe Colloquium on Mobility and the Humanities, which took place here in Lancaster on the 14th of September 2014, led by myself and Peter Merriman from Geography at Aberystwyth. And even more befitting, I think, today's celebration is the fact that Pete and I met for the first time at CeMoRe's 10th anniversary colloquium at Lancaster House Hotel that James was talking about. And you won't be surprised to hear it was John Urry's subsequent offer to fund a colloquium organised by the two of us, which got the initiative off the ground. So there is a really nice connection back to that 10th anniversary event. From that, Pete and I's collaboration got going. Although geography as a humanities subject has, of course, been as instrumental in the growth of mobilities research as sociology, what was distinctive about our colloquium was that it also brought in scholars from history and literary studies. And I think it's the contribution of these two disciplines, along with related subjects such as film studies and cultural studies, and of course, art mobilities, which Jem will talk about shortly. The introduction of these new types of humanities subjects and creative subjects that has most transformed the mobilities research landscape over the past decade. The proceedings of this colloquium were eventually published 3 years later in 2017 as a special issue of the Mobilities Journal entitled Mobility in the Humanities. And this has since been published as a Routledge book and also translated into Korean. In the introduction to this special issue, Pete and I sought to initiate debates about the distinctive contributions that humanities research can and already has made to a deeper understanding of both movement and mobility through, first of all, the utilisation of textual methods. So, text as a resource, which is actually very enabling, as Colin was saying. Textual methods, philosophical traditions, maybe especially the work of Deleuze and Guattari and Henri Bergson, and then artistic methods and experiments with their origin in the visual and kinetic arts. So, just mapping out some of the things in which mobilities, humanities bring an extra layer of involvement. Indeed, it's a section of our introduction on kinesthetics that's probably had most impact since the issue's first publication, especially the invitation it laid down for mobility scholars to move beyond well-established research centred on material embodiment, such as walking and cycling, to those which find expression in textual representations and artistic practice. I'll come back to some of the problems of working with representational materials shortly, but one of the key points that we were trying to make here is that not all mobilities research needs to be folded back into contemporary debates. A focus on movement and mobility via textual and aesthetic sources can often be illuminating in its own right, and often, again, as Colin was saying, shed new light on how these processes were experienced historically, either in the near or distant past. And I guess that's been another dimension of my own work. My interest is in the recent past, so that the next project I'm doing is going to be from the 1990s onwards. But nevertheless, I still think about that at that historical moment, well, as history. The introduction to the special issue also tackled the question of how we could and probably should rewrite the history of mobilities research so that humanities disciplines and their related theoretical traditions may be seen to have played a crucial role in the origins of the original turn. So much so indeed that the new humanities turn now underway is arguably a return or revisiting of what was already there. Under this heading, we wrote in particular about the role literary and critical theory from the 1970s and 1980s played in paving the way for both the theories underpinning Scheller and Urry's new mobilities paradigm and, for example, Nigel Thrift's work on non-representational theory, as well as the thematic and conceptual focus of mobilities of different kinds in literary travel writing and post-colonial theory. Karen Kaplan's Questions of Travel, Postmodern Discourses of Displacement, and Mary Louise Pratt's Imperial Eyes, both published way back 1996, are two landmark texts always cited in this context. And on this point, it's also worth noting that Mimi Scheller's own early publications are also in the field of literary post-colonial studies. However, the story of how humanities disciplines such as literary and cultural studies undoubtedly help lay the ground for both the mobilities turn hasn't really followed through into their involvement in subsequent mobilities research until more recently. So it's a bit of an odd one. You could say that these humanities subjects were there from the beginning, but where have they gone since? And as many of you here are probably aware, I've now discussed the theoretical and methodological implications of humanities subjects such as English literature, engaging with the type of mobility scholarship characterised by the new mobilities paradigm and other post-humanist applications across a range of articles and book chapters. In several of them, I've accounted for literary scholars' reluctance to embrace the field on two counts. First of all, the dominance of interpretive frameworks such as post-colonialism and biopolitics to analyse mobility-themed concerns such as migration. So basically saying there's been so much research under those banners that those scholars really aren't interested in adding another framework to what they do. And then secondly, the fact that the new mobilities paradigm and a good deal of geographical mobilities research has been led by post-humanist approaches such as actor network theory, which don't always sit easily with text-based research. Oh, sorry, no, go away. Text-based research, yeah. This is because literary studies in particular still remains heavily invested in character analysis with a focus on the psychology of the individual and formal and aesthetic concerns. In addition, as evidenced in the book series Palgrave Studies in Mobilities, Literature and Culture, for which I'm co-editor, when scholars from literary backgrounds do engage with mobility topics, it's often at the level of theme and concept, and with the objective of shedding new light on the literary text itself, rather than engaging with debates in mobility studies per se. So this is actually a very big point. It's a very simple point, but a very big one. As editor for this series, we've published, I think, 12 books in the series. We get proposals all the time on topics which the authors think of as mobility topics, but the authors have got no knowledge whatsoever of mobility studies as we're talking about it now. So this has thrown down a particular challenge for us working in humanities, and thinking about values and with the whole business of field, as we were talking about earlier, how far can we go in saying that this is mobilities research if it's completely disengaged with the type of mobilities that most of us here have been involved in? Now, there are, of course, exceptions to this, which also illustrate how the dialogue between mobility scholarship and literary and cultural studies will hopefully become more dynamic and bilateral moving forward. And in a chapter for the forthcoming Routledge Handbook of Literary Geography, I've even produced a diagram. I've produced a diagram which seeks to capture the variety of ways and degrees of rigour with which the two constituencies are engaging with one another. So, see that very well, just a simple cline. What distinguishes each point on the cline is the extent to which the two fields interact in terms of methodological objective and practice. And as the two poles, literary and mobility scholars engage with one another's work in fairly limited ways, either to thematise an approach or as a way of informing an aspect of mobilities theory. And I go on to offer illustrations of all of these. And for example, number 7, I talk about John Urry's use of speculative fiction in What is the Future? He's got a whole chapter where he deals with literary text. But although it very much informs his, what he's doing in the book, it's not a close engagement with literary text. At the next step, points 2 and 6, we see both sets of scholars engaging with each other's insights and expertise in a more dedicated way, The literary scholar may borrow concepts from mobilities to help them demonstrate what's going on in their text, or the mobility scholar might engage in close readings of the text in order to exemplify a theory of social or cultural practice. So, diving down a lot deeper into those textual materials. However, it's only when we get to points 4 and 5, demonstrating a higher level of methodological awareness, that the publications really begin to speak to both audiences in a sustained way and to enter into debates germane to both bodies of scholarship. In the chapter, I go on to provide an example of publications at every point of the spectrum, citing the film theorist Neil Archer's recent work on experimental filmmaking in dystopian road movies as an example of what literary scholars might aspire to, i.e. that by employing subject-specific expertise, such as an awareness of aesthetic form, production techniques, reader-viewer positioning, they can get new purchase on what's going on into those texts and fold them back into some of the debates that we're working with. So humanities scholars can begin to push at the boundaries of mobility theorising and offer new perspectives on topical debates, such as the climate emergency, through very skill-specific approaches. The fact is that writers, filmmakers are often engaging with their audiences and making political points that are less than obvious and which far exceed the representational surface of the text and its more obvious themes, symbols and metaphors. So really it's a drive to go beyond the content of the text and think what some of the production methods actually involve. My own work, meanwhile, which is point 5 on that line, is situated more at the social sciences end of the spectrum than the literary one. So although I'm based in the literature department, I've got to say I am not a typical literary scholar. And this is because from the start of my career, I've always used literature to... I think it's the people for dinner, actually, but I'll get back to them. This is because from the start of my career, I've always used literature to explore social, cultural and political issues in the material world, rather than for the purposes of literary criticism per se. However, instead of engaging text to exemplify a theory or thesis, I've developed a multi-layered analytic process whereby I begin by making a broadly phenomenological reading of the text in question, with a dedicated focus on movement and mobility, before progressing to a second level analysis, which returns the discussion to the relevant debates in mobility scholarship. This was the method I employed in both my recent books, Drive Time and Mobility, Memory and the Life course, and seems to have become an effective working practice for me. It's also an approach which I think situates me as a mobility scholar still very much working within the new mobilities paradigm, in as much as my objective is to make visible aspects of contemporary and the contemporary and historical world precisely by focusing on mobilities in an exclusive and paradigmatic way, which is not what all the literary scholars who have now jumped onto the mobilities bandwagon are doing. For many of them, mobilities is there, but it's a much more incidental thing. So to what extent we would think of them as mobility scholars, I'm not absolutely sure. So looking forward, I would say that there's huge potential for humanities scholars to contribute to long-standing debates in mobilities research, especially by bringing in historical perspectives and through a focus on aspects of everyday life that the social sciences have found hard to access, for example, memory, affect, kinesthetics. Similarly, it's clear that mobilities theory has the potential to enrich humanities scholarship, especially by breaking into fields such as post-colonialism, which have got rather stuck in terms of analytic frameworks. However, both parties will need to attend closely to the methodological objectives underpinning their engagement if they're to maximise those benefits and avoid what we understand by mobilities research becoming simply too diffuse and diluted to become meaningful. Thank you. Sorry about the punch. I don't know, but we need to check, don't we?